Look at an X-ray of a World War II veteran, and you might see something that feels completely wrong. Buried in the chest, deep in the thigh, resting somewhere in the muscle, still there, decades later, is a jagged piece of enemy metal. It wasn't missed. It wasn't forgotten. At some point in the war, a surgeon looked at that exact fragment inside a bleeding soldier and made a deliberate decision not to chase it. To us, that sounds backwards. If metal is inside the body, you take it out. But on the battlefields of World War II, that instinct could be fatal. If you get a splinter, you pull it out. If you step on glass, you remove it. It's a baseline human reflex. If a foreign object enters the body, get it out. And that makes perfect sense in ordinary life. But war is not ordinary life. When we imagine battlefield medicine in the Second World War, we usually picture the frontline medic, a man in the mud and smoke, sprinting toward the wounded, wrapping bandages around a torn leg, trying to stop a soldier from bleeding out before the next shell hits. That image is real, but it's only the beginning of the story. Frontline medics were there to keep a man alive long enough to move. They controlled bleeding, treated shock, and pushed casualties down the evacuation chain. The deeper decisions, what to cut, what to leave, how much surgery a human body could actually survive, those were made farther behind the line, in field hospitals and forward surgical tents. And the wounds arriving there were often not what you'd expect. World War II was, overwhelmingly, a war of fragments. The vast majority of injuries didn't come from neat bullet paths. They came from jagged metal, thrown by artillery, mortars, and bombs. And a fragment wound is never just a metal problem. When shell shrapnel enters the body, it doesn't just slip neatly into tissue. It tears, it tumbles, it crushes. It rips through muscle, shatters bone, and destroys tissue well beyond the actual path of the metal. And it rarely enters the body alone. A fragment acts like a freight train, driving dirt, grease, and bits of the soldier's own uniform deep into the wound track. So by the time that soldier reaches a surgeon, the body is fighting far more than a piece of iron. It's dealing with mangled tissue, severe contamination, crashing blood pressure, and a plunging body temperature. To a civilian mind, the piece of metal feels like the central problem. It's visible. It's the enemy still sitting inside you. But to a wartime surgeon, the fragment was often just one variable in a much deadlier equation. Because if that surgeon decided to go hunting for every deeply embedded piece of metal, the surgery itself could easily kill the patient. To chase a fragment buried deep in a thigh or chest wall, a surgeon has to enlarge the wound, cut through tissue that is still alive, open fresh muscle planes, disrupt blood vessels, and keep a severely traumatized patient under the knife for far longer than his body can tolerate. And in trauma surgery, time is never neutral. Every extra minute means more blood loss, more shock, more stress on a nervous system that is already hanging on by a thread. The surgeons of World War II learned a brutal lesson. The obvious thing was not always the smart thing. So if the priority wasn't taking the metal out, what were they actually doing? They were performing debridement. It sounds clinical, but it was a race for survival. Debridement meant the careful, aggressive removal of devitalized tissue, flesh that had been so crushed by the impact that it was no longer truly alive. Dead muscle inside a wound is a ticking clock. It has no blood supply. It can't defend itself. And in the dirt of Europe, it became the perfect breeding ground for one of the worst nightmares in military medicine: gas gangrene. Gas gangrene wasn't just a bad infection. In dead, oxygen-starved tissue, bacteria would rapidly multiply, release toxins, produce gas inside the flesh, and turn a survivable injury into an amputation, or a death sentence. That is why battlefield surgeons were not performing treasure hunts for metal. They were hunting dead tissue. They would open the wound, wash out the dirt, pull out the shredded uniform, and cut away non-viable flesh until they reached healthy muscle. If a piece of shrapnel was sitting right there, easily accessible, sure, it came out. But if it was buried deep, far beyond the zone that actually needed cleaning, going after it meant trading one danger for several worse ones. And that logic extended to the wound as a whole. Civilian intuition says, close the wound, stitch it up, seal the damage. But many serious wartime wounds were deliberately left wide open. If a surgeon stitched a contaminated wound shut too early, they were trapping remaining bacteria in a warm, dark, oxygen-depleted environment. They were turning a dirty wound into a sealed incubator. Instead, wounds were treated, packed with sterile gauze, and left open to the air. They would only be stitched days later at a base hospital once the threat of infection was gone. It wasn't sloppy medicine, it was sequential medicine. First, keep the man alive. Then, keep the wound from turning lethal. Then, make him transportable. Only after all of that do you worry about a complete repair. The field hospital was not there to restore a soldier to perfection. It was there to stop his body from crossing the line into irreversible collapse. Now, this was never a universal rule. War medicine is full of exceptions. Location changed everything. A fragment deep in the soft tissue of the back might be left alone, but a fragment resting against a major blood vessel, that had to come out. A piece of metal inside a knee joint or a shoulder, that would destroy the mechanics of the joint, so it was removed. Shrapnel near the spine or the eye demanded immediate extraction. The true rule wasn't leave the metal alone. The rule was understand what is killing the patient right now, understand what might kill him tomorrow, and do not sacrifice the first problem to solve the second. And what happened to the men who kept the metal inside them? They revealed something incredible about the human body. In many cases, when inert metal stays inside soft tissue, the body adapts. It can't dissolve the steel. It can't destroy it. So, it isolates it. The body builds a dense wall of fibrous scar tissue around the fragments. It turns the shrapnel into a sealed prisoner. Not always harmless, but often stable enough that a young man could board a ship home and live for another 50 or 60 years with a piece of the war still lodged inside him. We like to imagine medicine as a clean, steady march toward completeness. Find the problem, remove it, finish the job. But trauma doesn't give you a clean narrative, especially not in war. War strips away the luxury of perfection. It forces doctors to think less like mechanics and more like brutal mathematicians. Which tissue is already lost? Which procedure isn't worth the shock it will cause? What looks unfinished but actually preserves life? World War II surgeons were operating with less time, fewer resources, and more pressure than we can easily imagine. The choices that might look careless from the outside were actually built on a profound understanding of human survival. They knew the body doesn't die from the symbolism of having metal inside it. It dies from blood loss. It dies from shock. It dies from surgical overreach. This isn't just a story about shrapnel. It's a story about the discipline to stop cutting when more cutting becomes its own threat. It forces us to rethink what good treatment actually looks like under extreme conditions. Not perfect treatment, not aesthetically satisfying treatment, just good treatment. The kind that gives a wounded body its best chance to survive the next hour, the next ambulance ride, the next day. World War II surgeons didn't leave fragments inside because they failed to understand the wound. They left them because they understood the wound too well.